everyone. Thanks for joining us again. I'm Katherine Druckman. I'm talking to Doc Searls and Petros Koutoupis, some familiar names, I hope, to everyone by now. And what we're talking about today is sort of the current state of open source, but also in particular technologies like containers and the relevant pieces, I suppose, to the cloud services that all sort of fit together. But we're talking about how those things affect open source, the open source community, and how open source ideology is and is no longer relevant in these different development communities. So I'll let you guys kind of throw in some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll give a kind of high-level non-code developer perspective, which is, as in wearing my hat as a reporter on all this, which I've been doing forever, is that there's a strong sense that we're pretty far from where open source was and what it was about when the term was first adopted in 1998, so 21 years ago. And there was at that time a kind of, I'll call it a moral imperative, but there was a sense of obligation, at least, that that everybody contributing sort of not only had to, a sense of having contributed, but was part of a project to improve the world and to improve more than just the way code got developed. And as part of it was all part of a sharing thing. And the way here's a metaphor that, I may just drift off where I was going with that, but it's sort of like what happened with ride sharing. I mean, the original idea with Lyft and Uber was, this is ride sharing. I've got a car, I'm going over here, I can take people along, and I can also get paid for it. I suppose the difference would be that with source code, you're not getting paid for it. You might get paid for it, you might not get paid for it, but pay was not what it was about. It wasn't about being paid at all. It was sharing. And you shared the code and everybody could use it, and it was all cool. And what happened with Uber and Lyft is that they basically replaced, they were a hack on dispatch, and they replaced the taxi business with something, frankly, that was a lot better. But it was pretty far from the original purpose, which was ride sharing. Even if it's still called ride sharing, it's not really ride sharing anymore. And I think there's a little sense within the open source world right now that the kind of the equivalent of ride sharing, that we're all sharing this thing and we're all in this kind of thing together and we're doing it for the good of the world, has been replaced by something that's much more commercial, much less bound or much less about kind of the original purposes. It's just yet another way to develop code, and it's efficient and it does the job. But it's really not as much about doing something for the good of the world. And I feel like I was all over the map on that. Why don't you guys do a better job than I just did?
Well, so you said, getting paid, not getting paid. So Petros and I, we as we've discussed, we both get paid to contribute to open source projects in various ways. Whether it be code or, in fact, we could say that, remember way back when Linux Journal was a thing, we got paid to contribute to open source. I mean, whether we were writing code or not, we were contributing to open source. We were elevating people's stories. We were teaching people how to use things. We were highlighting other contributors, which is in itself contribution, right? But that said,
yeah. Well, an interesting thing here is you were being paid for your labor and not for the code, right?
Sure,
yeah. In other words, you weren't paid by the line. It wasn't like you were working in a factory and you were paid by how many pieces of cloth you produced or how many hunks of lumber came out at the other end. So, but you're paid for your labor because you do a good job. And I'm wondering about, and you're doing it for open source, but is there any difference? I mean, any difference of kind or quality between doing that for open source, doing that as open source code, or doing that as essentially closed source and private code that the world would never see in a shared way?
I mean, there are inherent differences, but like we've talked about, and not to beat the dead horse, but it's different than it was, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. In fact, this is something that maybe we should do next time. Maybe we should take, a poll of our peers and figure out, why people are working the way that they're working. Why did they choose a job working on an open source project versus a different one? Is it purely just because it was a better position? I mean, maybe it was.
But here's a question for both of you guys, which is, are you doing the work you're doing because it's open source, or because it's just a good job? And B, do you have a sense that there is a difference for other people now? In other words, do you think it matters to other people working around you that this is an open source project and not a closed source project?
Well,
that's a good question. Yeah. I'll let Petros, because I'm not really sure what the answer is.
I will say this. I worked in multiple environments. I mean, when I first got out of college a long time ago, everything was closed source. We developed our own firmware code on closed architecture. We maintained it internally. And as time went on, we started, and as open source started to gain momentum, the companies that I was working for was starting to adopt these technologies, but it was still a closed environment. You still developed a, closed application that ran on top of that. And so now today, yes, I work for a company that is focused on an open source project and nothing but that open source project. But, you ask Doc, do you choose, and you being, anybody in the, development, world, do you choose to work on an open source project? Implies that there's enough companies out there willing to pay for talent on specific open source projects. And I don't know that is the case for enough people to have the ability to choose.
That's a good point.
Makes sense.
Yeah, well, there's a question there, which is what, I'm just guessing. I don't know if anybody even has a figure on this, but what percentage of programming jobs are open source? I would imagine it's pretty high at this stage.
At this stage, I would say yes. There's a lot more companies adopting open source technologies and developing, applications around open source, but they're not necessarily, they're just using the open source technology to build their own products. They're not working actively on open source projects, which are two completely different things.
So that's a good, I think, segue into our original sort of topic, right? Which is the cloud ecosystem, let's call it, and all of the service providers and underlying technologies and all of these little pieces that fit together that are cogs in this larger, cloud technology business model, if you will. We've talked about how in the past, in previous episodes, we've talked about how, was it Richard Stallman that said the cloud is just other people's servers?
Yeah, cloud's other people's computers.
Yeah.
Also something that you read on shirts nowadays.
Right. So we've talked about that a lot, and how maybe because of the segmentation, or maybe because of just the vast number of moving parts, or maybe because of the disconnect, there seems to be an increasing departure from emphasis on open source ideology. And I'm wondering, and I'll ask this question of both of you, is it innovation and complexity that goes with it? Is that inversely proportional to support for open source ideology, or can those things coexist?
I don't know. I'm what I find myself wondering is there an open source ideology anymore? Or if
Well,
there
hey,
is
that's a good
one,
question too.
you know,
I mean, there must be, surely.
yeah, I mean, I think there is, but I think it's likely to be something that's a kind of a golden rule level thing, rather than something that's specifically stated. I know that from the very beginning with the open source initiative, which I was around pretty closely at the time, it was all about licenses. You know, it's all about licenses and what the different licenses did, and the licenses were all about freedom, at least at the GPL level, at the sort of the bottom substrate level. That was about that, um, but basically freedom and openness. But those are, I wonder if those are now, especially openness, so profoundly practical that it just makes a whole lot more. In the same way as it made more sense to just go ahead and produce 2x4s than to produce, um, hewn logs that, were licensed exclusively by one supplier. It's sort of like that. It's like, well, we have, you know, the open stuff is easy to make and easy to use, and it's all over the place, and we're just going to do that because that's the easy thing to do.
I think part of the challenge is, the business models of various companies. As I stated earlier, working with open source and working in open source, two completely different things. Or I should say, I should rephrase that. Work developing on top of open source versus developing open source. When I worked with my last employer, we built a product. The product was built on top of open source. It was a Debian-based distribution. We used Debian packages and a vanilla kernel from kernel.org, but our secret sauce was an application that ran on top of it. It was that secret sauce, that application that made our product and made, the actual solution stand out and made it, sellable, as opposed to now where, as I stated earlier, I'm working with my current employer on an actual open source project. And I don't know that the ideology is gone. I think it just depends on where your business model stands as a company. With my last employer, and it's no secret, IBM, we actually had attorneys or lawyers specifically there to ensure that whatever open source packages we pulled into our distribution complied with the licenses and did not conflict with our proprietary code. So it's not that we didn't care about the open source, it's just our product wasn't open source and we only leveraged it as opposed to us developing it, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Well, here's the question. I mean, this is the open source initiative, which I just brought up here, and it's about building bridges between open source communities of practice, and I'm wondering. I mean, and Katherine, in your case, you work on Drupal, and I guess because you're employed there, you feel a sense of community with that. Do you think there are communities in the way there used to be? Are they the same?
Oh, I don't know. I'm really biased. I don't feel a part of the Drupal community because of the work that I do. I've always been a huge cheerleader for Drupal since I started using it, which goes back even before Linux Journal. I think some communities are inherently more cohesive for whatever reason. For some magic recipe somehow developed over time that made certain communities more pleasant than others, or more fun than others, or more motivating than others. And I don't think, or at least for me personally, I don't think that has anything to do with where I get a paycheck. I think that's just, no matter what my job is, I would hope that I was working with Drupal just because, I mean, whatever, I'm that person. But I think a lot of open source enthusiasts are like that. I think that Petros, I mean, I'm sure I can't fathom that you would suddenly do some work that was not somehow connected to Linux in some way. But if you did, I can't imagine you would somehow disappear, from the Linux and open source community as a whole, right? I mean,
I don't know that anybody nowadays can escape.
That's a good point.
Open source in development. I'm being honest here.
But also, what does it mean to be part of a community? Here's something that I was thinking about recently. There are certain, I would call them trade shows or community events that I really enjoy going to. I haven't had the opportunity to go very often, but I really enjoy it tremendously. And whether or not my job specifically relates to it, I would probably go to those things just because, I want to say hi to, people who I have worked with in the past, or, former Linux journal writers or something. Like I would go to Scale just so I could hang out with Kyle and Bill, so I don't know. It's an interesting overlap between work and community when you are working in something open source related. Do you feel that way, or is this just me? Am I like?
I was on mute.
Oh, sorry. Well, I meant actually Petros, but yeah.
Yeah, no, go Petros.
No, I understand what you're saying. It's been a while since I've been to any of these shows or conferences, but in terms of community, obviously, depending on your role with your employer, it takes on a different, once upon a time, I remember with our employers, or, one of my earlier employers, they were all completely all for us attending these shows. But as the company matured and as the product matured, and as we started to, and like I said, we still complied with all these licenses, but once things became standard, we slowly backed away from community involvement, which I didn't really enjoy, which I didn't really appreciate, but it's just the way the company was moving. Nowadays, though, I have no choice but to, because of the current work that I'm doing with my current employer and being actively involved in an actual open source project, community is everything. Whether you are on these mailing lists, public issue trackers and code reviewing platforms, to even going to the conferences, you're surrounded by the same faces, the same people, and like I said, community means everything. I mean, it obviously takes on a different role, obviously different experience depending on where, the type of product that you are developing.
I think so. I think camaraderie, I think, is incredibly important to the type of work that goes in to, working on and improving open source projects, because you have to be, constantly collaborative, constantly.
Well, and it's also nice to get feedback.
Yeah.
What everybody else is doing, whether they are a competitor or not, it doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, to be able to be out there, communicate, and just talk to these people, it goes a long way.
Right. So again, back to the original topic of cloud services, though. So how has let's say the fragmentation that is a product of I guess the evolution of that whole service provider landscape, if you will, how has that led? Like, okay, let me back up a little bit. 20, 25 years ago, you just had a few projects, right? And most people were working with just a few things. Am I like a technology stack, let's say, had a shorter list of buzzwords than it does today. I hope I'm not oversimplifying, but today, I'm sure, Petros, in your case, you probably you would identify with a number of different communities. You work with I don't know, Kubernetes is one, yes?
Well, we use
Or do you,
Kubernetes, yes,
okay, but you don't
and
necessarily contribute.
I don't contribute to Kubernetes, no, but
Okay.
yeah, we've used it. We've made use of it, and yeah, that's all I'm gonna say.
Okay, fair enough. But
I can't share too much. I'm sorry.
sure. Well,
Yeah.
regardless, I'm just saying you work with many different technologies and different pieces of software and different platforms and all of these things. So I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this. I guess what I'm saying is that relevant? Is the fragmentation relevant to the sense of open source community?
I mean, you say fragmentation, but
Maybe I
don't
made that up.
I don't necessarily see it that way.
Oh, okay.
You know, when a new buzzword gets thrown out there, and we see one every few months, right? The latest and greatest thing. First, it was cloud computing. Then it was hybrid computing. Then it was multi-cloud or edge computing, or you know, it doesn't matter. I mean, there's so many out there. But what I usually see, and this is the, you know, what usually happens is there's a new buzzword, people get excited, and then there are 100 different open source or closed applications that come to the forefront that claim that they do that one thing. But at the end, there's only one that comes out victorious. You know, you mentioned Kubernetes, but before Kubernetes, you know, became the most popular one, there were 5 or 6 other container orchestration platforms. But now, fast forward to today, nobody hears anything about Swarm or Mesos or anything else. They just hear Kubernetes. Yeah. So you say fragmentation, and it starts off that way, but eventually comes all back to one. And this is, you know, the same thing happened with OpenStack way back when. And now we have, you know, Kubernetes. I mean, even cloud computing itself, you have Amazon's, AWS. You know, Microsoft has their Azure. IBM has their cloud that nobody hears about. That was a dig at IBM. But,
That's fine.
Google has their own cloud. You know, there's like 10,000 different cloud service providers out there. But at the forefront, what do you hear? You just hear AWS and Azure. That's it. So clearly, it starts off fragmented, but at the end of the day, it all comes back to just one or two. So I don't necessarily see it that way, but you know, that's just how I interpret it.
Okay. Well, I thought maybe we might segue a little bit into something that Doc was talking about.
Well, let me before we do, maybe I'll take this to where you're going to segue it anyway. I want to go back briefly, at least, to what Petros said, both about how it's almost inescapable, actually, to work on open source at this point, because there's so much out there. And I imagine programmers just have a lot of choices around that, especially since it's all being developed in cyberspace anyway, right? Where you live doesn't matter a whole lot. But then about community, like to me, like if you in the Drupal community, Katherine and Petros, and the communities you're working with of code development, those are sort of self-contained. People become expert in them. They're glad to be in them, and there are communities around that. But then you hear the term, you know, the fill in the blank community. It kind of reminds me of, and I'm involved in one with the identity community, the digital identity community, because I co-host the Internet Identity Workshop, which is going to have its 30th next year, and a number of people in my community there talk about the identity community, but I don't see an identity community at all. I see a whole bunch of people working within on their own stuff. You know, there are ones around Microsoft, there are ones around Amazon, there are ones that are, working on one particular topic or another within this sort of general topic of digital identity. And a third of the people who show up, and we get 300 every time, around, give or take. Usually a little bit less, but this time it was a little bit more, I think. A third of those, at least, are newbies every time. And I don't think any of them would say they're part of the identity community, even though we'll talk about it as the identity community, right? And so I just wonder about identity, about community being kind of thrown around as a very general topic when there isn't one. I mean, I think maybe that's the thing I'm trying to get toward. In the beginning, open source as a cause was itself a community. And I think at this point, there are many open source communities, but not one overall community like there was.
Yeah, I see where we're, okay. No, I understand what you're saying in terms of fragmentation. Because before, it was just Linux.
Yeah. If you were doing something on the internet, fill in the blank. You were making websites. If you were conducting some sort of business, if you were in the sciences, you probably had a Linux server, and you probably, had a certain, a limited number of tools to work on it with. And
now all of it's being brought back together. And this is making fun of a project that I know that many in the open source community have an opinion on. But a lot of these open source projects are coming together thanks to our friend Leonard Petering and his Systemd project. So,
oh, I thought we were just talking about GitHub. That's interesting.
No,
tell us about that one.
This is a dig at Systemd. But anyway, no, a lot of these open source projects are coming together and under the roof of a single application that's taking way too much control over the Linux ecosystem. But anyway, I digress. That's just.
Well, that's interesting because what is Systemd and what's that all about?
Oh, Systemd is an init process that's become more of an init process. I mean, when I say init, I'm assuming we all know the init program that pretty much launches all of the services in your Linux distribution during boot time and manages all those services. But anyway, Systemd has become a pretty bloated monster where it does more than just start and manage your services. It manages your logging ecosystem. It manages it does so many things. I don't even know where to begin. And every single time I, pilot or test drive a latest release of insert whatever distribution here, I always find myself screaming at it because it's pissing me off so much. But anyway, listen, I've had at least 2 beers in me right now.
Get it down. Somebody crack.
And I am
later, Katherine, insert the cracking open a beer sound.
Oh my God, that'll be soundtrack. Great.
I want to hear that.
This is me making fun of me, but it's I know what you're saying. Once upon a time there was a single community, but now, it's just you don't even know where to begin. And in many cases, one will not communicate with the other if there is any overlap.
Yeah,
that's an interesting point.
That just as frustrating.
So before we forget, I think that Doc had a minor digression about GitHub, and I was really curious.
Oh no,
because that's
the way Petros is talking, I thought it was going to go to GitHub because people.
Oh.
I hear people complaining about GitHub because it's so all. I mean, in the same way as you were saying earlier, Petros, about Kubernetes as now the kind of the one container system out there, that there were a lot of places where you could share code. I mean, you could
SourceForge was one.
SourceForge was a big one, or much earlier, but GitHub is it kind of right now. I mean, it's the big one, and
it's the big one for sure. But a lot of people are, have their own instances of GitLab.
Well, you don't have to use it. I mean, Git is still there, and you can still do lots of stuff with that.
I thought you were going to mention the anti-ICE protests. There's a big thing in the open source community, if there is still one open source community to rule them all. There's been a lot of controversy about some projects, some entities supporting the nastier parts of our government.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of that
Well,
going around. But
well, open source can be used for anything. So of course
yeah,
somebody's going to support that. But I guess
exactly.
if you're working on it, yeah, okay. But you were going to go somewhere, Catherine. So
No, oh yes, well earlier. So we talked about, again, back to the fragmentation idea, or or just the original idea of all of these various segments, of this, again, cloud landscape, because all of this whole conversation basically came out of something that Doc emailed us, which we've actually not mentioned at all.
yeah,
And that
we
is,
had 4 or 5 topics there. We didn't cover a
yeah,
lot of it, but that's good.
that's this Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and we started, we were going over their website and looking at all of these entities that are part of this ever-growing landscape, or so it seems anyway. And noting which pieces, which projects, companies were open source, and I'm just wondering, the question that I wanted to get to was just, are there certain pieces out there that lend themselves to open source, and some that don't? I mean, is that where we've gone? Have we come to a point where we've found that open source works really well for, I don't know, databases or automation, and we thought, well, maybe it doesn't work so well for, oh gosh, I don't even know, continuous integration. Or insert buzzword here.
Yeah.
Are there certain, I mean, is that part of it maybe?
Well,
or are there just, is there more room for closed source in certain areas?
Well, I'm sure there is, but just to go back to where this came up, at least for me, I went to the I don't even remember what it was called, but it was put on by the Linux Foundation earlier this year, and I wrote about it in Linux Journal, and it was about cloud native, basically. But I didn't realize until I got there that it was really about 5G and 5G development, and kind of, it was a lot of planets and moons flying around what the big telcos are going to do with 5G, and they have this thing called the cloud native interactive landscape, and listeners can, it's a short URL, it's landscape.cncf.io. That's landscape.cloudnative interactive landscape, I guess, Computing Foundation, cncf.io. And it's this vast thing. You need a really big screen to look at it. I'm looking at it right now on a laptop, and I can't see the whole thing. And it has open source and closed source tiles within it, little chiclets, in categories like, app distribution and development, and within that are database, streaming and messaging, application definition and image blend, continuous integration and delivery. And within each of those, about half of them are logos on a white tile, and about half of them are logos on a gray tile. And the white tiles are all open source, and the gray tiles are not. And if there's a filter on the left, one of which is open source landscape, and if you click on that, all the gray tiles drop out. And when the gray tiles drop out, for example, all of Kubernetes certified service providers disappear, all Kubernetes training partners disappear, and about most certified Kubernetes hosted disappear, and most certified Kubernetes distribution also disappear. I think more of them disappear than did when I first looked at this a few months ago. And some of this I could see because a service provider at the level that service is provisioned is generally not open source. But I really don't know, beneath that. I don't know exactly how to interpret this, except that it's a landscape and not a community. I guess that's one way to look at it, which is, this is a picture of stuff that's happening, and it's issued by an organization within the Linux Foundation, which is itself pretty dedicated to open source, but it's very much an organization that deals in reality. And in reality, companies have their self-interests, and they have their, and a lot of those, most of them, in fact, are closed in, for lots of good reasons. Security being one of them. You don't want other people to look at what we're doing with money or how we're charging people or how we keep track of, what's in our namespaces and all of that. But I have a selfish interest in this as well, in that one of the residual benefits of having written for a Linux journal is that I will be going to the next one of these things. It's not CNCF again. It's something else. It's in San Diego. It's next month. But I'll be seeing some of the same people, and I'll be having some of the same questions. And I'll be reporting it somewhere, not Linux Journal, because that's dead, but
perhaps
somehow. But here, certainly here. And it might even be interesting to set up something there, where I'm interviewing people and so forth. That'll be interesting.
This landscape chart kind of bothers me in the fact that, you have a lot of companies that are essentially paying money, becoming members, just so that their names and logos show up here. And in some cases, I don't know that they do anything cloud native specific, aside from the fact that their services can be leveraged in a cloud native environment. For instance, if you go under runtime and under cloud native storage, you have vendors such as NetApp and Pure Storage. I mean, these are great companies. I'm not knocking the companies themselves, but at the same time, it's just data storage. They will, expose a piece of storage to a server, and that server will have access to that storage in a cloud native computing environment. You'll have containers accessing it, containers running in specific applications that are orchestrated via Kubernetes. Maybe that application is going to be MongoDB. It doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, I mean, this landscape, closed source, open source, it's just, I don't know. I have a problem with it primarily because I could create a company right now, pay my fair share of money, and then my logo will get thrown out up there. I don't know that there's any value.
Yeah. So I'm looking at a couple of these. So you mentioned cloud native storage. So there's one here that's in white. It's Longhorn Rancher Labs, cloud native distributed block storage built on and for Kubernetes. The repositories in GitHub. I noticed when I'm looking around these that the ones that are called open source all have a repository in GitHub. Next to it is one called Kasten, runtime cloud native storage, and it doesn't have a repository at all, right? And I guess I'm not sure if there's a difference in kind between either of those really, and that's maybe part of it. Here's OpenSDS, first commit 3 years ago, latest release 4 months ago, but they're in GitHub, and they have 405 little stars. I don't know what that means, but I get the sense that and I know for a fact what the Linux Foundation is trying to do is draw a giant circle around all of these and encourage companies to be as open as possible within it, and to kind of call it a landscape and not a community. But I think you're right that you could throw something up there and you've got a repository in GitHub and you're qualified, and there it is. Anyway, yeah.
I just find it kind of interesting that these things are divided into their respective categories, and it's interesting to me that some of them, like cloud native storage, whatever that even means, are mostly gray.
It's just storage.
Exactly. that way, as I said that out loud, I was thinking of you, Petros, because you're like, it's just a buzzword.
Is there any difference between let's look at, here's a metaphor.
But then automation and configuration is another example where almost everything is white. It's open source. So I don't know. I just wonder, okay, but maybe that's a spurious correlation.
There's one gray, and it's the obvious VMware.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, and this kind of gets to the sort of the community point a little bit, maybe. If you think about storage in of physical things, there's the storage facilities where you basically outsource your basement, right? You bring all your extra boxes, or you're moving, and you stick it all in a storage facility. Does it really matter whether that storage facility is open source in the sense that they built the entire thing out of open source lumber, meaning there's nothing proprietary in the lumber or in the metal or any of the pieces that are used in making the damn thing, or if it's all, say, prefab and it came from a closed source fabricator of storage units? Does it make any difference?
No,
it doesn't really. And because you really don't care. I mean, as a user of it or as a customer of it, you don't care. I mean, in a similar way, if you just look at AWS or Azure at this point, because Microsoft is now bragging on being a Linux company, and they're, I think, maybe even the largest contributor, or the largest in terms of money contributed to the Linux Foundation. That Amazon and Azure may be running on Linux is kind of immaterial in this. I mean, you may be running yourself running a Linux instance on it, but whether or not the back end of that is closed or open, does it matter a whole lot? I mean, the first cloud storage I know of was on IBM Z series mainframes, which are not open. But that's, it almost didn't matter, right? And I mean, Petros, you helped me set up my Searls.com server on one of the many hosting services, and I don't know what they're running. It doesn't.
They're running Linux. It's just,
I'm sure they are, but
well, you have the choice, and it doesn't matter because to an end user such as you or I, you don't have that exposure. But at the end of the day, I know a lot of providers, including the one that Searls.com is running on, they give you a choice. Do you want it on a Linux-backed one or on a Linux-backed one? And at the end of the day, does it matter because of what is exposed to you, right?
Yeah. I don't think it does. So I guess one of the questions I'll have for the Linux Foundation is, other than trying to get the 5G world to be coherent, which I think is what they're doing. I mean, they're making sure that the many contributors of code to 5G projects of one kind or another are not duplicating each other's efforts and are working together on stuff. And I think the cloud native stuff is only part of that. Although the story that I get from the people I know who are cynical about 5G will tell you, or have told me anyway, that the whole 5G purpose has nothing to do with gaming or low latency or high throughput or any of that. It all has to do with competing with Amazon and Microsoft by setting up their own clouds as close to the edge as possible. In other words, they want to get into Amazon, the AWS and Azure business, and that's what this is about. It gets the telcos into the Amazon and Azure business in cloud native storage that's relatively close to where the customers are. And we'll see, I suppose. I mean, that's an interesting question, whether that's what it's about or not. So, but I'll have some questions for them about that. I'm really curious what's the sort of, if there is a community side to this, what is the community other than a whole bunch of developers working on a giant new business opportunity? And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's just cool enough. That's the market at work, and that's what it is.
No, I really don't have anything to respond to that with, but I did want to circle back to the shit pile that is System D. I don't know why it tries to mount a remote NFS share before it brings up the goddamn network. In what world does that make sense? Tell me. I don't know. It's me venting again. I'm sorry.
I don't know anything really about System D, but there's a criticism section that says the design of systemd has ignited controversy within the free software community, not the open source community, the free software one, which I think is more of a community. Critics regard systemd as overly complex and suffering from continued feature creep, arguing that its architecture violates the Unix philosophy. Also concerned that it forms a system of interlocked dependencies, thereby giving distribution maintainers little choice but to adopt systemd as more user space software comes to depend on its components. So
well, think of Unix philosophy. You write one utility that does one thing really well. Right? Think about it. LS, CP. I mean, it does one thing really.
yeah.
Systemd that tries to do 100 million different things.
Right. When you bloat one piece of the puzzle, the whole puzzle kind of falls apart, basically.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
No, it just pisses me off because, you know, it's twice now. So I set up a print server here with the Raspberry Pi. And the Raspberry Pi runs Raspbian. And Raspbian, sadly, uses systemd. And it aggravates me every single time something goes wrong and it's hidden behind this one application. You know, if I want to, like I mentioned earlier, if I want to mount an NFS share, a remote NFS share at boot time, it tries to mount it regardless of how I configure my FS tab. I can tell it that it's a networking device. But for whatever reason, it still tries to mount it before the network service is up. That doesn't make any sense.
And what you're saying is because so many eggs are in one basket, you have limited control over changing it, and that frustrates you. Is that what you're saying?
It's limited with how you can muck with it, how you can tune it, how you can change it. You know, at least init was pretty straightforward and simple. You know,
I mean, this is
maybe I'm getting too old for this.
No.
Software simple is
I think it says something
stuff.
And I think there's a way of looping us back to something. I'm looking now at Unix philosophy, and which I kind of knew intuitively, but there's a couple of things that in this composability is one, as opposed to monolithic design. So I think what you're saying there in a way is that rather than doing one thing well and pulling together a number of things that do one thing well and composing them on your own as somebody implementing this, it's monolithic. It's all singing, all dancing.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, we're starting to see this trend, at least underneath the hood, with Linux distributions, where the kernel stands apart, but now the utilities that you and I have been using for the better part of the last, few decades in Unix-like environments are all going underneath one monolithic application. And not only does it go against the Unix philosophy, it just complicates things when it comes to maintaining, troubleshooting, debugging, what have you. Gone are the days where it's like, just push this to, the util Linux project, right? Go push this to bin utils project, or it doesn't even matter. Now it's just one. I don't know, maybe some people like that, but I, for one, am not part of that.
Well, there's okay. So is Kubernetes an example of monolithic thinking rather than composability? In other words, it comes pre-composed and is therefore monolithic.
I don't know that I would describe it as monolithic. I mean, it's designed and written to schedule and orchestrate containers.
Yeah. So it does what it's supposed to do.
It does that in a clustered ecosystem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are various components that end up making up Kubernetes, but at the end of the day, it's designed to do one thing. Now, people are developing modules for it to create more functionality in Kubernetes. For instance, there's this project that I stumbled on called KubeVirt, which was a Kubernetes module that works with VMs as well, like KVM, like type VMs. So it just didn't orchestrate work with containers.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's extending itself to cover a lot more. Now, does that, dip into the monolithic side of things? Maybe not yet, but I wouldn't call it monolithic.
Yeah.
Now, if it took over the storage underneath it and added the databases on top of it, or what have you, then we're talking about what systemd is doing type of monolithic, where it controlled every aspect of the container ecosystem or the cloud native ecosystem.
Yeah.
I don't see that with Kubernetes.
So in the Unix philosophy article in Wikipedia, it's interesting that they break it out into a number of areas. That Doug McElroy on one thing, Mike Jankar's on another, but all of them have this simplicity and modularity to them. Eric Raymond's 17 rules, which has used composition, write simple programs, write small programs, write readable programs, write modular programs. And, another one, small is beautiful, make each program do one thing well.
Yep.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yes. Simplicity is so undervalued. Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's tremendously valued. I don't know. I think
now here's a
valued in software.
Under criticism in a 1981 article titled The Truth About Unix User Interface is Horrid. That was in 1981 by Don Norman, who's not only a friend, but I just saw him 2 days ago. And he's in his mid 80s now, and he's still he's got a design lab at UC San Diego. He's the guy who wrote The Design of Everyday Things and Things That Make Us Smart and stuff like that. He's actually a cognitive scientist, and he's really great. And I don't know, I'll have to ask him when I see him next if he still feels the same way about that. I don't think Unix is supposed to have a user interface, really. I mean, I think probably at that stage, I mean, it's kind of like, what's the user interface for an internal combustion engine? Well,
I mean, that's sort of what Apple's done, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Good. And then what is exposed to the end user, whether you're running a MacBook or an iOS or anything else?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can open a shell and do something on it, and there it is. But yeah, I don't know. You might include a link to that one.
In Apple's case, why did they strip wget out of their Unix utilities? I don't get that. No,
I didn't know they did. Huh.
I'm just waiting for Katherine to chime in, but maybe she's got problems with her mute button.
No, I'm okay.
No,
I didn't know that. What do you mean wait, what?
wget, the utility. I have to do a homebrew install just to get wget on my platform so I can pull off files from the command line.
You know what? It's probably been so long since I homebrew installed wget on a Mac that I forgot about that. But yeah, you're right. Yeah,
they took FreeBSD, like the FreeBSD base, and just like further stripped it down.
You know what? I wonder if they did it in order to fit on a phone.
No, I mean,
it should have been long ago.
Yeah, they've done it on the MacBook a long time ago. Yes. On to beer number 3, guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think I'll find a nice editing spot. I think there's one in there somewhere.
The two beer podcast.
Oh, I like it.